Every rule in armored warfare was written in someone's blood. Every regulation, every standard, every line in the manual exists because of a specific disaster, specific people, and a specific mistake that no one was allowed to repeat ever again. The history of tank warfare is the history of the most expensive machines on the planet turning into mass graves, over and over, until armies around the world finally learned their lessons. Sometimes it took years. Sometimes it took a single afternoon in northern France. Today, 5 catastrophes that rewrote the rulebook. Flanders, Belgium, September 15, 1916. Winston Churchill and Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton were both against it. When Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Forces, demanded the new weapon be thrown into battle at the Somme, both men pushed back hard. It was too soon. There were too few machines, the design was still raw, the crews barely trained. Haig did not listen. On September 15, 1916, the British Army used tanks in combat for the first time in history. Of the 49 Mark I machines delivered to the front, only 32 reached their starting positions. The rest broke down on the way. Of the 32 that went forward into the attack, exactly 9 reached the German lines. 9 out of 49. The few tanks that did reach the German trenches produced an effect that exceeded every expectation. One German soldier later wrote that between his unit and the sun appeared monsters breathing death. The village of Flers was taken in minutes. A press agency correspondent photographed one of the tanks rolling straight down the main street, capturing the first ever combat photograph of a tank in battle. By the standards of that grinding war, it looked like a local success. But Haig had played his ace too early. The Germans recovered captured machines, studied their construction, and immediately began developing countermeasures and designing their own armored vehicles. The breakthrough that could have happened in 1917, with several hundred machines attacking simultaneously, never came. Churchill was furious. He wrote in his memoirs that the premature use of tanks had likely cost the Allies a decisive advantage in the war. The rule that became doctrine after the Somme is simple. A new weapon enters battle in mass, or it does not enter at all. Scattered, piecemeal deployment gives no tactical advantage. It educates the enemy. This principle was proven 11 months later, in November 1917, at a place called Cambrai, where nearly 400 tanks attacked simultaneously and punched through the Hindenburg Line 12 kilometers deep in a single day. That battle, not the Somme, showed the world what armored warfare could actually become. Cambrai, France, November 20th, 1917. Lieutenant Colonel John Fuller, Chief of Staff of the British Tank Corps, had drawn up a plan that was supposed to change the war. Not a slow grinding through defensive lines, but a single hammer blow. 476 Mark IV machines across a 10-kilometer front, with no preliminary artillery barrage that might warn the enemy. The Hindenburg Line, considered impenetrable, was supposed to collapse in one day. At 6:20 in the morning on November 20th, 1917, the British tanks moved forward. By the end of the first day, they had advanced 12 kilometers, a result that months of bloody attrition had failed to achieve. 8,000 prisoners were taken. In London, church bells rang for the first time in years to celebrate a victory. But the High Command made an error that could not be unmade. General Julian Byng, commanding the Third Army, transformed what was originally conceived as a limited raid into a full-scale offensive, and committed nearly all available forces into the breach, leaving almost nothing in reserve to exploit the success. The cavalry units assigned to pour through the gap stood at their start positions without clear orders to advance, while the narrow lanes cut through German wire were being cleared. By the end of the first day alone, the tank corps had lost 179 machines, broken down, knocked out, or swallowed by trenches. The survivors were fighting without the coordination with infantry that the plan had called for. On November 30th, German forces launched a counterattack with 20 fresh divisions. Within 10 days, they had recaptured almost everything that had been taken. The British Army ended the battle where it had started, having lost roughly 40,000 men in total. The lesson that entered the doctrine of every major army is this: a breakthrough without reserves is not a breakthrough. It is a trap. From that point forward, the rule that no less than 1/3 of attacking forces must remain in reserve, ready to exploit success or absorb a counterattack, became a mandatory standard for any large offensive. That standard has not changed since. Halfaya Pass, Libya, June 15, 1941. There was a firm conviction embedded in British military doctrine at the start of the Second World War. Tanks fight tanks. Infantry does its job, armor does its own. The separation seemed logical on paper. In the field, it was catastrophic. In June 1941, British command launched Operation Battleaxe, an attempt to break the siege of Tobruk and drive German forces back from the Libyan-Egyptian border. General Wavell sent 200 tanks into the assault, including heavy infantry machines called Matildas. The Matilda had a reputation. Nothing in the German arsenal was supposed to be able to touch it. That reputation died at Halfaya Pass. Rommel had positioned 13 anti-aircraft guns along the pass, 88mm caliber, flak guns, officially built to shoot down aircraft. But the German gun crews knew something the British had not yet understood. An 88mm round fired horizontally punched clean through Matilda armor from 2,000 meters away, well before any tank gun could return fire. The guns were dug deep into the sand and camouflaged. The British columns had no infantry support to suppress the artillery crews because doctrine kept those functions strictly separate. Of 17 Matildas that attacked the pass, 13 were destroyed. Operation Battleaxe collapsed within 3 days. Wavell was relieved of command. In the aftermath, the British Army acknowledged for the first time since the previous war what German commanders had understood since Spain. A tank attacking alone is a target, not a weapon. Only infantry can neutralize enemy anti-tank positions. Only the combination of tanks, infantry, and artillery creates genuine combat power. This principle entered British field regulations after the destruction at Halfaya Pass and has not been removed since. Every combined arms doctrine written in the Western world traces part of its lineage back to that ridge in the Libyan desert, where 13 Matildas stood burning in the afternoon heat because 2 separate arms of the same army refused to fight together. Sinai and the Golan Heights. October 6, 1973. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated strike against Israel. On the Sinai front, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal on pontoon bridges with 1,600 tanks. On the Golan Heights, 1,400 Syrian machines fell upon 2 Israeli brigades holding the line with roughly 170 tanks between them. In the first 48 hours, Israeli armor suffered losses no one had predicted. Arab infantrymen were going into battle with Soviet-made Malyutka anti-tank missiles and rocket-propelled grenades, light, cheap, carried by a single soldier. They burned through Israeli armor again and again. Israeli armored units in the south lost up to 40% of their strength in those first 2 days. But Soviet-built tanks burned differently. When a Malyutka, or an armor-piercing round penetrated the hull of a T-55 or T-62. Observers initially mistook what happened next for some kind of self-destruction mechanism. The turret would leave the hull with a deafening crack, sometimes climbing several dozen meters into the air before crashing back down beside the burning vehicle. The crew had no time to understand what was happening. This became known as the jack-in-the-box effect. The cause was structural. Soviet tanks stored their ammunition in a carousel autoloader, a ring of shells positioned around the base of the turret, immediately adjacent to the crew. When a round penetrated the hull, one shell detonated. That shell ignited the next. The building pressure inside the sealed hull found the weakest point in the structure, the turret ring, and the turret went airborne. American engineers studying the reports from the Yom Kippur War received a clear design requirement. The crew must survive even if the ammunition detonates. When the M1 Abrams tank entered service in 1980, its ammunition was relocated to an isolated compartment in the rear of the turret bustle, separated from the crew by armored doors. Above the ammunition sat blowout panels designed to direct any explosion upward and outward, away from the men inside. Along with the redesign came a strict regulation that remains in force today. The ammunition compartment door must be closed at all times, except for the single moment when the loader reaches in to retrieve a round. That regulation is a direct consequence of October 1973. Every time a loader on an Abrams closes that door behind a shell, he is following a rule written by Soviet tank turrets flying over the Sinai desert. Grozny, Chechnya, New Year's Eve, 1994. Russia's defense minister Pavel Grachev had promised to take Grozny with a single airborne regiment in 2 hours. On the night of December 31, 1994, columns totaling several thousand soldiers entered the city. 7 motorized rifle regiments, 2 tank battalions equipped with T-72 and T-80 machines, armored personnel carriers across the board. Command expected a walkthrough. The 131st Separate Maikop Brigade, over 1,000 soldiers, pushed into the city center and moved toward the central railway station. The crews had no maps at a scale useful for urban combat. The largest available were 1 to 100,000, essentially useless in a city. Some officers sketched street layouts by hand on loose paper as the columns moved. Chechen fighters had removed street signs and repositioned them to disorient the enemy. Then the Chechen defenders did something no military manual had prepared them to counter. They let the column roll deep into the city, allowed it to pass, and then RPG teams destroyed the first vehicle and the last vehicle simultaneously. The column was boxed in, immobilized in the middle of narrow streets. Soviet doctrine held that cities should be bypassed, never entered. Infantry had not trained for urban warfare. The soldiers would not leave their vehicles. They were afraid to. The tank guns could not elevate high enough to engage fighters on upper floors and could not depress far enough to hit positions in basements. By January 3, 1995, the Maikop Brigade had lost nearly 800 men killed or captured. 20 of 26 tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Of more than 1,000 soldiers, roughly 160 walked out unharmed. 2 weeks later, the Russian army returned to Grozny, but with a completely different approach. Infantry now walked ahead and to the sides, clearing buildings. Tanks followed as fire support, not as the spearhead. Artillery worked methodically, block by block. ZSU 23-4, Shilka self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, the only weapon with sufficient barrel elevation, burned out firing positions on upper floors. The rule that entered every military doctrine after Grozny can be stated in 4 words. Tanks without infantry die. In urban combat, armor does not lead, it covers. Infantry goes first. This principle cost the Russian army thousands of lives before it was finally written down. 5 catastrophes, 5 rules. Not one of them was born in a headquarters building over a map. All of them were written where machines burned and crews died. The next time you see armored vehicles on a parade, perfectly polished, immaculately painted, remember, every weld on that hull, every maintenance regulation, every paragraph in the combat manual is someone's catastrophe that an army decided never to repeat. If this video made you think differently about what military doctrine actually costs, leave a comment below. Tell me which of these disasters hits hardest, or which rule you think still gets ignored today. If you want more videos like this one, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It genuinely helps the next video reach people who care about real military history, not the sanitized version.